Hi, Grade 4. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 17 of The People of Sparks. It is called Doon Accused. Word of the tomato throwing and Torrhen's accusation of Doon spread quickly through Sparks. Some people believed Torrhen, some didn't. But no one could prove who was telling the truth. Torrhen said he'd seen what he'd seen in the middle of the night when he couldn't sleep and took a walk to the field to look at the stars. Doon said he'd been home all night sleeping, and that his fathers and the other in the room knew it. But people said he could have slipped out quietly without anyone knowing it, couldn't he? He could have gone down there and done his mischief and come back, and they would have all been sleeping through the whole night. At noon that day, when he and the others showed up at the Partons' house for their midday meal, no one spoke to him. Martha let him in, and they sat down at the table where places had been set for them as usual. Doon's father said, "Good day," and Mrs. Poulter said, "How are you?" Miss Thorne and Edward Pocket looked around at the family's stony faces and tried to smile. Ordinary put food on their face. Was it an even smaller amount than usual? And passed the plates to them. Kenny ate tiny mouthfuls. His eyes darted nervously from face to face, but no one spoke. Finally, Doon's father said, "Excuse me, but perhaps there's been a mistake." Martha looked at him coldly. "I don't believe so," she said. "Perhaps you're thinking that my son Doon actually did what he's been accused of." "In this household," said Martha, "we do not approve of wasting food." "Neither do we," cried Doon. "I would never do such a thing. I didn't do it." All eyes turned towards Doon. He could feel a red flushing rising in his face. "Really," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "I didn't." "Who did then?" said Ordinary. "I don't know," said Doon. "No one knows," said Mrs. Poulter in her firm voice. "Certainly we aren't going to believe the word of one unhappy little boy against the word of this young man, who has proved himself so outstanding." "Why not?" said Martha. "Torrhen Crane is a decent boy as far as I know. I don't see why you call him unhappy." "All you have to do is look at him," Mrs. Poulter said. Miss Thorne nodded. "I think she's right," she murmured. "Well, one of you people must have done it," Martha said. "Certainly none of us would have." "Nothing has been proved one way or the other," said Doon's father. "It would be unfair to draw any conclusions." There was an uncomfortable silence. Everyone focused on eating. When it was time to leave, Kenny passed out the food parcels and he handed one to Doon. He silently mouthed 3 words. "I believe you." At least one person was on his side, Doon thought. It made him feel better, but only a little. In the end, because it was one person's word against the other and there was no proof either way, nothing was done. Officially, the identity of the tomato thrower remained a mystery, but the effect of all of this was going to make the people of Sparks and the people of Ember even more resentful and suspicious of each other than they had been before. Doon felt unfriendly eyes following him wherever he went. At first he tried to explain when people glared at him that way. He spoke reasonably. "Why would I get up all the way and walk to a field in the middle of the night to throw tomatoes at a wall?" He said. "It doesn't make sense." But people didn't seem interested in the reason. He was one of them. And that meant he was strange and might do anything. So Doon stopped trying to explain. He kept his eyes on the ground and ignored the people who muttered darkly as he passed by. It wasn't just Doon who suffered from the tomato incident. It was all the refugees from Ember. Sometimes the villagers called them names out loud in the street. It was as if those smashed tomatoes had brought all of the quietly rumbling resentments out into the open. The town simmered like a pot about to boil over. One morning, Doon found a crowd gathered in the plaza when he came into town for work. Both Sparks people and the Ember people were clustered together, looking at something. He edged between them to see what it was. Across the pavement, someone had scrawled a message. It looked as if it had been written in mud. The sloppy, runny letters said, "They must go." The town stared at it silently. A few of the villagers seemed embarrassed. They looked sideways at the Emberites and shook their heads. "Mean," someone muttered. But others scowled. One man, noticing Doon, glared at him so angrily that Doon felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. This message was there because of him, he knew it. He put his head down and hurried away. At the hotel that night, people were upset. They clustered in buzzing groups out on the front steps, talking about the words painted on the plaza. Dune saw Tick striding among them, speaking with everyone, his face flushed and his eyes glittering. When he came towards Dune, he paused. "They've turned against us," he said. "I knew they would. We mustn't stand for it." And he plunged into the crowd. A day passed, and then another. The sun blazed down, but Dune felt as if darkness had invaded him. Protests and questions raged through his mind. Why had Torrin pointed at him? Was it just at random, or had he singled him out for some reason? Why did Chugger believe Torrin and not him? Who had written the muddy message on the bricks in the plaza? Lena did not return, and this added to Dune's glumness. According to the note she left Mrs. Mordaunt, she would have been back by now from wherever she'd gone. Dune's feelings about her were divided between worry and anger. He tried not to think about her, since there was nothing he could do. Whenever he had a free moment, he holed up with a book and tried to forget about what was happening in the village. Edward Pocket brought him a steady supply. Edward was obsessed with his job. Every now and then, Dune would ask him how it was going, and Edward would get a feverish look in his eyes and say, "Ah, it goes by inches, young man. By millimeters, I've done this much." He held his thumb and forefinger a tiny distance apart. "And this much remains to be done." He reached his arms as far as they would go. "It's a gargantuan task. I press forward, but will I finish in my lifetime? It is doubtful." His fingers black with dust, he often came home in the evening later than the workers who went into the village, and he was so tired by then that he usually went straight to bed right after dinner, even though it was still light. Dune would hear him mumbling in his sleep inside the closet. He could make sense of only a few words. "Caterpillars," Edward would say. "Cathedrals, cattle, chemistry, Christmas." Then he'd groan and thrash out, banging his bony limbs against the closet door, and would go silent for a while. When he muttered again, he'd be on a different letter. Hamlet, Harry Potter, Hawaii, heart surgery, hippopotamus, hog farming. Dune imagined that Edward's mind was so stuffed with information by now that there wasn't room for any more, and the excess had started leaking out in the night. Sometimes Dune passed the Sparks School on his way to work in the morning. It was a small building with a wide open porch all around it, where the students often sat to do their lessons. The children of the village, there weren't very many of them, went to school only a few hours of the day, and only until they were 10 years old. Kenny Parton went there. He would wave to Dune when he saw him going by, and before the trouble with the tomatoes, the other children would look at Dune curiously, a few of them smiling. But the first time Dune passed the school after the tomato trouble, he saw 15 or 20 cold-eyed faces turned towards him. Someone shouted, "Get out of here!" And someone else threw a crumpled wad of paper over the porch railing at him. He walked faster, looking straight ahead. A moment later, he heard the teacher scolding the class for rudeness, but not very sternly. The next day, as Dune and the others arrived at the Partons for lunch, Kenny peeked out from behind the corner of the house and beckoned to Dune. His eyes were wide, and his voice even softer and more timid than usual. He said, "You know at school yesterday?" Dune nodded. "It was sorry they yelled at you," Kenny said. "They shouldn't. You didn't do it." "How do you know?" said Dune, who was feeling crabby just then at all the residents of Sparks. "Maybe I did." Kenny shook his head. "No," he said. "I don't think so." "Why not?" said Dune. "I can just tell," said Kenny. "I can tell about people you wouldn't." He gave Dune a quick, shy smile. Dune was touched. Kenny looked like a timid little wisp, but there was something strong inside of him. "I wish you didn't have to leave," Kenny said. Dune smiled. "We'll be here for a few more months," he said. "Then what?" Kenny asked. "We go away and make our own town." "Where?" asked Kenny. Dune shrugged. "I don't know. Out in all that empty space somewhere." Kenny looked down at his feet. He stood for a minute in silence. Then he said, "That will be really hard. How will you get food?" "Grow it, I guess, just the way you do it here." "But you'll be leaving in the month of chilling. That's the beginning of winter. You can't grow food in the winter," Kenny said, looking up at Dune with worried eyes. "Winter?" said Dune. "What's winter?" "You don't have winter where you come from?" Kenny's eyes grew very round. "You mean it's always summer there?" Dune was confused and slightly alarmed by Kenny's tone. I don't know those words, he said. Kenny stared at Dune, his blank face with surprise. Seasons, he said. They're the seasons. In summer it's hot, in winter it's cold. That's all right then, said Dune, relieved. We're used to cold. But you can't grow food in the winter. It's really cold. And clouds cover the sun, and it rains. Rains? Kenny was so amazed that his mouth dropped open. He flung his arms open and wiggled his fingers like drops sprinkling down. Rain! When water comes from the sky, and the river rises, and sometimes it floods, and the dirt turns to mud. Dune felt as if his mind had suddenly stopped. He stared at Kenny's wiggling fingers and tried to grasp what he was saying. Water dropped from the sky? But people's clothes would get wet. Everyone would have to stay inside. And if they couldn't grow food... Wait, he said. You mean the town leaders know it will be winter when we leave? They know it will be cold and wet? I guess so, Kenny said. He lowered his eyes and looked up again. Probably they meant to send food with you, he said, to get you through the winter. That must be it. He gave a small, hopeful smile. That must be it, he said again, and he darted away. Dune followed. His vision of the future, already shadowed by anxiety, had just grown several shades darker. One morning, a week or so later, as Dune came out the door of room 215, he nearly bumped into Tick Hassler, who was running at full speed down the hallway. Something's happened, Tick called out to him. What? Said Dune, breaking into a run himself to keep up with Tick. I don't know, said Tick, but I heard people out in front shouting. Tick must have jumped out of bed and not taken time to do anything but throw clothes on. He hadn't combed his hair, he hadn't tied his shoes, he hadn't even washed his face. There were gray smudges on his neck and below his ears. In the usually well-groomed Tick, these were signs of serious alarm. Dune's heart beat faster. He took the stairs 3 at a time, crossed the lobby, and, still following Tick, pushed through the door. Outside, a crowd stood in the field, staring up at the hotel. Dune ran out to join them, and he turned around to see what they were looking at. Someone had scrawled the words on the wall of the Pioneer, tremendous black letters, rough and scratchy, as if written with burnt wood. Go back to your cave, said the message over and over again. Go back to your cave, go back to your cave. The few ground floor windows that hadn't already been broken were broken now. Dune stood staring for a minute, feeling sick, and then anger rose in him. This was the work of whoever had slopped that mud message onto the plaza. Another ugly message, bolder this time. Around him, the others were rushing forward, shouting, staring at the scrawled words. Some of them stood silent and glum, with arms folded or hands in their pockets. Others shook their fists in the air and vowed revenge. Tick was more furious than anyone, but he didn't yell. Dune watched him weaving through the crowds, seizing one person after another by the arm, talking in a voice as sharp as a blade, but low and steady. His blue eyes glinted like steel. This is what I thought, Tick said. This shows it. They've pretended to be kind, but their kindness isn't real. Here's what we know from now on. They hate us. He narrowed his eyes. They hate us and they want to get rid of us. Well, I'll tell you what. They want us to leave? I'm not leaving. Are you? He scanned around the crowd. No, said someone. Dune thought about what Kenny had told him. Winter, cold, rain. Maybe Tick is right, he thought. They do hate us. Do you like being called cave people? Tick cried. Do you like being told to crawl into a cave? And angry voices, 20, 50, 100, cried out, No! Dune went up close to the wall of the hotel and examined the words scratched there. He pictured the people who had done it, clutching their burnt chunks of wood, writing these big, angry strokes in the dark of the night. Yes, Tick was right. Hatred seethed in these letters. He almost felt as if their strokes had scraped his open skin. End of chapter 17.